Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you. This will probably be the shortest sermon I ever have delivered, but I love this day. This has become like the second largest attended Sunday that we've done in the last few years, this celebration of Black History Month, and I absolutely love it. Just love it. I heard a great joke this week I want to share with you. It said, when we're children, we make funny faces into the mirror, and when we're middle-aged, the mirror gets even. So yesterday, John and I were getting ready to go to dinner, and I'd run upstairs to get my watch. I put it on and looked in the bathroom mirror, and my dad was in the mirror. And I was like, how did that happen? I was wearing like a V-neck sweater and a button-down collar, which is something my dad wore a lot. I don't wear it that often, but I looked up, and there he was. And, I was talking to someone before the first service that it's, I see from inside here, so I'm still 25. And yet, I know that things are changing. I was thinking, too, about my dad and my family and this family, and I'm going somewhere with this, just wait a minute. Some people don't like to use the word family when they're talking about their spiritual community because they have bad associations with the family of their origin. There might have been abuse and trauma, and so that's not a word that they use. And so I don't use it very often. I usually talk about our spiritual community, that we're here to support each other. Community is a beautiful word. And all month long, we've been discussing the beloved community as a concept that Dr. Martin Luther King, he didn't invent that, but that was what he shared, this idea of community as being the place of healing and wholeness and evolution of human consciousness. I've read this quote several times, but I just want to come back to it one more time because I think it's so powerful. That Dr. King was asked, where is all this going? All of this, civil rights movement and equality and justice, where is it going? He says this, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. That I think that's what we're up to. As a community, as this specific community, we are about healing, about bringing opponents into friendship, about replacing the doom and gloom of the old age, about bringing about healing in the hearts of men and women so that we can see ourselves as who we truly are more and more. See ourselves in the mirror of Spirit's reflection. I was thinking about why we spend so much time and energy on Black history, and I think it's important. As you just saw with Norma Green up here, this is not out there somewhere. That's our Norma. That we're talking about this fight for equality. You wonder why she's out there trying to get you to register to vote? She knows the power of your vote to change our world in a way that is more in alignment with your understanding of spiritual truth. She was part of that. Last year, we had our own Cora Ledette share about her family's story of civil rights, where they actually had FBI agents guarding the road to their farmhouse in Louisiana because there had been attempts on the life of her parents. A bullet was found in the crib next to her baby sister's head. This is not out there somewhere. This is our history, our community. This community is a part of this evolution of consciousness into equality and freedom and justice. This is ours. And I think about it too. Dr. King said this, and it's still true. He said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. But look around, not in this room, not here. And why is that? Because we have chosen to be together in a community where we recognize the divinity and the equality of all. And we white people have something to learn from you, our sisters of African descent. We need your stories so that we can learn what it was like to be oppressed in that way, so that we can heal our part of whatever it is in consciousness that makes that happen, so that we can be advocates for greater change, for greater love in the public sphere. This is why we're about. So thank you. So Sheila, thank you for bringing us those stories of Unity's Black history. Thank you to Ahmad last week with his amazing little sermon that he gave. And thank you to Cora for this year speaking about the legacy to her grandchildren. You know, she wrote a poem for her grandchildren, if you weren't here that Sunday. And she said she wanted her little beautiful grandchildren to know that their Black lives matter. Now that phrase has been controversial to some to not understand where it's coming from. Because they're saying, well, shouldn't all lives matter? Of course. But the fact that some people thought that Black lives didn't matter is why we need to have this movement that they do. We have to remember where we come from. We are all equal, but we are not all treated equal, and this is the growth and the evolution of human consciousness. Out of World War II, there was a German minister, Lutheran minister named Martin Niemöller. There's an umlaut in his name, Niemöller. And he said this, you probably heard it. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I am not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I am not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. Again, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I am not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. After the horrors of World War II and what the Nazis did to minorities, not just the Jews, but mostly, what they did to all of the Romani people, to LGBTQ people, what they did was so horrific that people asked the question, how could this happen? These are good church-going Christian people. They let this happen in their country. How? And so this minister, accepting his own part of that responsibility, stepped forward and wrote that poem. That we bear responsibility for the collective consciousness. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke about how I'm really encouraging us not to get into the Facebook fights with the people who are voting for the other guy. Don't do that. It's not helpful. And some misinterpreted that as a call to silence. No. I'm not asking you to be silent. I'm not asking you to not act. I'm asking you to speak up in the right way for what you believe in, not against people. Stand for the ideals and the issues that mean something to you. That's what we're being asked to do. Step into what we're creating together, because we are. All of us are creating the future of human consciousness and society right now with our thoughts and our actions and our votes. We're doing it. So let's do it actively and in alignment with what we believe to be true of Spirit. This sounds like I'm preaching at you a little bit, and that's on purpose. There is a prophetic tradition in many of the religious traditions, but particularly in Judaism. This was a strong social commentary tradition. The prophets, I grew up Pentecostal, and I thought the prophets were the ones who stood up and spoke in tongues, and they gave their own interpretation, said this is what's going to happen. They're not fortune tellers. Prophets are social critics. And there's a small book in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the book of Micah, 6 chapters, and Micah tells this beautiful story about how people, well, it's not a beautiful story. People were not doing it right. They were not being fair in their treatment of those who were less able. They were not worshiping God in humility. They weren't doing the things that he knew was good for people, for his people. And he took ownership and he spoke against it and spoke for a return. And it's one of my favorite verses in all scriptures from any tradition. It's Micah chapter 6, verse 8. If you don't know this, it is so powerful. There's a code here for the way that we bring our spirituality into the world. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? 3 things: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To act justly means to work for fair treatment of all people, to treat people fairly yourself. To love mercy means to extend beyond fairness into love and compassion, and to walk humbly with God. Do you all know the difference between humiliation and humbleness? They're not the same thing. To walk humbly means that I am in right relationship with reality. I am here to be all that God has created me for my own personal sense of fulfillment and contribution, and to be of service to the world. That's what we're about in this church. That's what I'm asking all of us to step into. Thousands of years ago, this was given to us. I'm asking us to take it up. And we look to these figures, these men and women in history who have exemplified that. And I want to tell you about James Weldon Johnson. How many of you know who James Weldon Johnson is? Well, that's why we do Black History here, folks, because not very many people raise their hands. James Weldon Johnson is an amazing poet and writer and educator and advocate. He was born just 8 years after the end of slavery. In 1871, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law in 1863. He was born to parents who had never experienced slavery. His father was a freedman from Virginia. His mother came from the Bahamas, and her family was educated and well-to-do and in power. And she was an amazing mother. She infused her sons with this idea that they were not to be limited by what society told them they were or were not. Did you hear that? That they were not to be limited by what society said they were or were not. She might have been a unity minister before her time. Does that not sound like our principle? We are not limited by our own thoughts or by the thoughts of any other person. And so James had an aptitude for words. His brother John had an aptitude for music. James went on to, they wrote musicals together on Broadway. They did all these amazing things. And right before they were already published in New York, and they were about to leave Jacksonville, Florida, where they'd been educated. They were going to go to New York and make their fortune on Broadway, which they did. And their school that they had gone to, which was formed 5 years after the end of slavery, it was called the Stanton School in Jacksonville, Florida, the first elementary school to educate young black men and women, children, elementary school. They had gone there. Their mother was a big part of getting them there. They asked them to write a song for the celebration for Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and they had a very distinguished guest coming. It was Booker T. Washington, the great orator and educator, and they asked the Johnson brothers to create a song. And the year before, James Weldon Johnson had written a poem, and he thought this would make a great song. And he showed it to his brother John, and together they created this song that says, "Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty." If you've been coming this month, we sing that at the end of every service for Black History Month. This song, which they taught to those 500 children, and they sang it for Booker T. Washington, and this is what James wrote about it. He said, "After the song had passed away from our minds, but the school children of Jacksonville kept singing it. They went off to other schools and sang it. They became teachers and taught it to other children. Within 20 years, it had been sung all over the South and some parts of other parts of the country. Today, the song," and he wrote this in the 1940s, "today the song, popularly known as the Negro National Hymn, is quite generally used. The lines of this song repay me in an elation almost of exquisite anguish whenever I hear them sung by Negro children." In 2009, at the inauguration of President Barack Obama, this lyric from the third verse of Lift Every Voice was quoted in the prayer. "God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in Thy path, we pray." Coming back to where we started from in this conversation, do we use these spiritual principles for our own success, well-being, and life fulfillment, or do we use it to serve others? The answer is yes. Yes. We are here to get all of our needs met, and so that we live a life of freedom and fulfillment, so that we may give our gift to help the collective. As I mentioned, James was very successful as a Broadway playwright, or a composer, lyricist, His brother John was the composer. He was part of that legendary Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. The music, the literature that came from that section of Manhattan in that time still rings. It may be the first time that black men and women in this country found their voice and their power, and it's still singing out today. He was part of that. He was the first ever hired black professor at New York University. An amazing man. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt named him as the consul to Argentina and then to Nicaragua. An amazing man of accomplishment, success, well-being, had a beautiful wife. They both worked in the NAACP. But he knew that there was more for him to do. I don't know if you knew this, but after the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, it's when many of the defeated whites in the South began this practice called lynching, where they would go find men and women of color who were doing things they didn't think they ought to, and they would just kill them. And this was not prosecuted in the southern states. This is into the 1910s. This was continuing. This continued to happen. And there was a white senator in Missouri who said, this has got to stop. We need federal law to be able to prosecute lynching. And James Weldon Johnson knew that it was his to do to help this law be the law of all of the land of America. And so he stepped from his comfort and success, and he stepped out into activism, and he did what needed to be done, and that law was passed. He was a man of great action and great personal fulfillment. He's an exemplar to us all, and I want you to hear a little bit of his words. I've asked our own C.J. Bland to come forward and give us one of the poems of James Weldon Johnson. This is called The Creation.
And God stepped out into space. And he looked around him and he said, I am lonely. I'll make me a world. As far as the eyes of God could see, darkness covered everything. It was blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress pit. Then God smiled. And the light broke. And the darkness curled up on one side, while the light stood shining on the other. And God said, that is good. Then he reached out, and he took the light into his hands, and he rolled that light atop his hands that he had made the sun, and he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God rolled up in a shiny ball, and he flung it against the darkness, spanning the night with the moon and stars. Down between the darkness and the light, God hurled the world. Then God himself stepped down. The sun was in his right hand. The moon was in his left. The stars were clustering about his head while the earth was under his feet. And where he walked, he hollowed the valley out and bugled the mountains up. But then he stopped. And he looked and he saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world. And he spat out the 7 seas. He bared his eyes and the lightning flashed. He clapped his hands and the thunder rolled. And the cooling waters from above came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed, and the pine trees pointed their branches towards the sky, while the mighty oak curled down into the hollow of the ground, and the river ran down to the sea. And God smiled again, and a rainbow appeared and curled itself around God's shoulders. Then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand. over the seas and over the land. And he said, bring forth. Bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hands, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun. He looked at his moon. He looked at his little stars, the whole world, and all his living things. And he said, I'm lonely still. So he sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river, God sat down with his head in his hand. And he thought and he thought. That he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay. And by the banks is where he held him down. This great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the heavens, who flung the stars in the most farthest corner of the night, and who round the earth in the middle of his great hands, this great God, like a mother kneeling over her baby, kneeling in the dirt, toiling over a piece of clay until he shaped it into his own image. And into it, he blew the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Amen. Amen.
Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.